really, really believed that I was dead.
You might know Louise as a TV personality or an online star, but over the last 3 years, her life was really turned upside down. You had a day that was the best and worst day of your life.
I went into my childbirth a really healthy person, and all of the things that you can imagine that could go wrong went wrong. I couldn't understand how I could still be alive. I always have at the back of my mind the memory of everything disappearing. So I really know how short life is.
How has your life changed since then? I know that you recently made the decision to liquidate one of your businesses.
Even my accountant said, Louise, this business, it's not good for you. You're putting money in, someone else is taking it out.
How have you managed to build from that point to now, I guess?
People hate this answer.
What is up, and welcome to Working Hard, Hardly Working. Today, I am joined by Louise Thompson, a woman with an incredible story of resilience and strength. You might know Louise as a TV personality or an online star focused on wellness and fitness, but over the last 3 years, her life was really turned upside down by a series of extremely traumatic events. She has been incredibly open about this and open about the intense trauma that she faced following life-threatening complications during childbirth. Her experience is a very raw and honest account of the challenges she endured, from battling PTSD to navigating the complexities of recovery, both mentally and physically, and also in things like how it affects your wider life, how it affects your relationship with your partner, with your child, all of these different things. And I've always said how this podcast isn't just about work in the sense of a career, but a wider definition, which encompasses the work we all put in every day to make our lives not just a professional success, but a personal success as well. And I truly believe that healing and recovery is some of the hardest work that you can ever do in life. And Louise was so open about this and about her whole journey in a way that I think is so honorable, and the effect of that on her wider life. And I have no doubt that anyone who has been through anything traumatic or anything similar to this, or just big life changes that have huge impacts on the rest of kind of what you thought your life would look like or your everyday, will be able to take away a lot from this and get a huge amount of value from her story. So I'm extremely thankful to Louise for sharing her story with us. This conversation is deeply moving and a testament to the power of vulnerability and perseverance. It also contains potentially triggering topics, including PTSD, childbirth, post-natal trauma, and suicide. So if you'd rather not hear about these topics, even through Louise's lens of how she's come out the other side and how she's built her life from this point, then you might want to give this episode a miss. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. This is a real privilege.
I'm very excited. We have wanted to get this episode in for so long, So I have a lot to talk about with you, and I'm very, very excited to get into the conversation. But first of all, I'm going to ask you what I ask everyone, which is, at the moment, do you feel like you are more working hard or hardly working?
Such a good question. Working hard or hardly working? I think I'm working hard. Yeah, I've really turned a corner. I'm pushing. You know, there's like the push and the pulls. Mm-hmm. I'm in that, I'm going for it phase.
Like back to school season.
And actually, because I've had such an odd couple of years, mm-hmm. Where I really had to slow down. I think in the last 6 months, I've kind of spent like a year auditing everything. Playing catch up. And then now over the last 6 months, I'm like ready to go again.
And how have you audited everything? Because that's something I'm a really big fan of. Like, I love a life audit.
I know you do. I follow a lot of the stuff that you do. And you're so good at it. Thanks. To be honest, it's just been an internal process of pulling everything that I've ever done and ever achieved together into one spreadsheet. And I realized actually that for so long, I was working fully independently, doing everything myself. I mean, I have worked with Ryan, my partner, and we'll kind of go through like the weird transition of the various parts of, you know, just my career, I suppose, from start to finish, because I've never really had a conventional job. But one of, I think, the biggest things that I've learned over the last couple of years is the fact that I've been doing too much on my own, and I haven't had a lot of control over what I've been doing. There hasn't been a lot of structure. So I've just really been like accounting for everything. going through every invoice, putting, various different assets into one place, and, even like really simple things. And I'm sure you've got like a whole team of people doing this, but just putting like my social media stats into a document so that I can see if I'm, increasing or decreasing. Really little things.
Yeah.
And that feels really good. And then also, working with other people, like outsourcing a lot of stuff. So kind of collaborating with people, or just, employing people. Collaborating sounds so fancy. Just employing people to help me with things. Like a legal person, a business manager, long overdue.
Yeah, no, and it makes a lot of sense. And obviously you've been through a huge amount over the past few years. And I can imagine that even just setting aside some time and just, these really not that important, but good to do things, it feels, I always think, quite cleansing. It's like a cupboard clear out.
Yes, it's a spring clean, but an autumnal clean, but actually it's a post-trauma cleanse for me. And really it's worked out as more of a full life kind of cleanse. And what I realized is that, I often, when I talk about kind of my trauma, especially in the early days, I would refer to old Louise versus new Louise. So there was the old me, and then there was, the new me, and the new me wasn't in a great spot for a really long time. What I'm trying to say is I wanted to get back to the old me. I wanted to get back to the person that I was before because I was comfortable. And what I've actually done is I've managed to get back the good parts of that old person, but I've also gained so much. And I think that I never would have done all of the things that I'm doing now if I hadn't gone through a really terrible time, because I was just in this hamster wheel. So the world actually forced me to slow down. I'm undiagnosed ADHD. I think I do suffer with, I self-label as neurodiverse, and I'm not very good with change. So I was just, in this cycle, like go, 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 go. Don't need anyone else around me. Just do my thing. And actually, now I've had some real time to reflect on everything. I've realized there's like a lot more that I could be doing. And also, you've got to slow down in order to speed up.
I want to start at the very beginning. I know you speak in your book about how you were very lucky to face quite little adversity early on in life. Could you tell me what life for early Louise looked like and what her ambitions were as well?
Yeah, I was such a goody two-shoes, honestly, teacher's pet, like angel, until I reached actually the teenage years. I had a really lovely childhood, and actually looking back at parts of the book where I kind of speak quite explicitly about my relationship with my parents and things, there were a few tough times. My parents got divorced when I was 11. That was really tricky. I never really knew the answer as to why. I felt as though I didn't, I was brought up in an environment where children weren't really spoken to by adults. And I think that was like a thing that was passed down through the generations. My parents, they were very, strict, serious. My dad always said to me that his parents just wouldn't speak to like him and his siblings. And he was lucky that he had siblings. So at least he was one of three. So yeah, it was on the whole, like a really joyful childhood. And I had my brother a couple of years younger than me, and we grew up in Notting Hill, so very privileged. My dad, both of my parents came from modest backgrounds. I think they would still be considered as middle class, but they weren't handed everything on a plate. And my dad actually left school when he was 15. I think he got expelled for like driving a lorry through the school, and he was just really naughty. That'll do it. Yeah, I know. He crashed into the school, and school was not for him.
That's taken me by the
Isn't that so random?
Okay.
So he basically left and set up his own thing and did really well. And he worked really hard, and he was in the property industry. And it was a lot easier to make money in that industry back then. And we then grew up in one of these cool houses in Notting Hill, and it was great. Yeah, and I had a great time until I probably got to like 14, 15, 16. And then I started drinking a lot and going out on the weekends. I think the moment that we had freedom, I really took advantage of it and I abused it. And I think because I'd always been so controlled, putting so much pressure on myself to perform well in everything that I do, whether that is work or sport or, social stuff. The moment that I discovered alcohol, that was pretty like a bad time for me because it was the only thing that provided an off switch for my super overactive, like hyperstimulated brain.
I know you went to university after school. What, around that point, what were your kind of aspirations? Like, what did you see as success?
This is really awful to admit, but I really saw success as following a trend of what other people were doing. So I thought, you know, typically you would think, okay, going to Oxford or Cambridge, that would be a huge success. I mean, I was quickly told not to apply for those universities, which, yeah, and you went to Oxford, didn't you? But instead it was everybody wanted to go to Bristol or Edinburgh. So I thought, okay, well, I'll just put them on my UCAS form and Leeds and through. And I was a real sheep.
So talk to me then about joining Made in Chelsea, because you've talked about how much of your life at this point was really you kind of, you know, as you said, like floating from one thing to the next, and it was almost like the path of least resistance. I'm really interested in your decision to join Made in Chelsea at that point. It was very early on, it must have been. I remember when I was watching Made in Chelsea at school, you were on it. And I was obsessed. So
such a good show.
It was
to watch but not be in.
I can imagine. How did that even happen?
So basically I was studying up at Edinburgh, and a couple of people I knew had already featured in a pilot, and it was originally going to be called Chelsea Girls. I think that was the working title. And there was a girl called Amber in it, Rosie, who I was at school with. I think Spencer was in the pilot, and we already had a relationship. So when I was on my gap year, I met him and we started dating. And then when I went to uni, that kind of didn't work for obvious reasons. And I was happily, you know, cracking on with my life, trying to study and kind of get by at university. I think it's a struggle for a lot of people anyway, especially if you've come from an environment where everything is so controlled at boarding school. You know, it's so regimented. You've got such a tight structure around you. And then to have the freedom at university is a bit like, what am I doing? Like, I have to go to library garden. I have to learn how to look after myself. So yeah, I had a couple of years there, and I think it was in my second or third year. The producers basically called me and they said, "Would you come and join us on this show? We're starting the first season." And I said no, because I think Towie had come out at that point. That was that was sort of the pioneer of reality TV, and it was actually the same exec producer who created that then went on to create Made in Chelsea as well. And it didn't have the best reputation. I loved watching it, but I never saw myself being in a show like that. And I'd even been quite snobby. I thought, this is a waste of an education. You know, I come from here. Why would I then go and do there? So it was an immediate no. And I kept saying no, and they kept calling, and they just ground me down. I think what it actually took was for me to go through quite an unpleasant breakup up at university to think, I haven't got that much to lose anymore. Like, I'm willing to take a bit of a risk. I need to change direction. It was brutal spending so much time in the same relatively small city as my ex. And I was actually quite keen to spend a bit more time in London. So they twisted my arm and I said, okay, fine, I'll try it. And I said, I'll try it once. And it was really hard. I remember getting the train down. I had to be really incognito. They were like, don't tell anyone, which was the worst thing, because I'm a really honest person. Like, I hate the art of like deceit and being sneaky. And they said, okay, well, we're going to get everyone's natural reaction, so no one else on the existing cast knows that you're going to be joining. And as someone that hates the element of surprise, I hate being surprised. It's not in my nature to surprise somebody else, because I know how much I hate it myself. I had to hang out in this bar around the corner. This lady was sort of telling me what to say. And then we walked in and it was literally like a surprise. And it wasn't a great reaction. People were like, yay, Louise. People were like, what the hell are you doing here? And I guess the rest was history. From that moment, I think it was Francis's art gallery party. I kind of got into it. And it didn't come naturally to me, because I'm not, unless back then when I was drinking, I would say I'm not a natural entertainer. You know, I'm not somebody that likes to command a room full of people. Like, I don't mind, you know, I enjoy an intimate conversation. And like, I'm making myself out to be, you know, total kind of loner or total introvert. But I don't love all of the attention being on me. So it was hard. And I was surrounded by people that it came a lot more naturally too. You know, Jamie I'd actually known for years, and he studied drama at Leeds. Like I'd seen him in plays up there. You know, other people were very good at acting and kind of good at bringing it, and I wasn't. And incidentally, I don't think Rosie really was either. We were the two girls in our whole friendship group at school that never got on stage. Like we were never in the plays. Maybe I was a tree. Looking back now, I feel quite positively about it. Like it feels nostalgic. Enough time has passed. I actually enjoy watching it now. I didn't watch it for ages after I left because I didn't want to miss it. If it was good, and if it was bad, then I thought, well, I don't need to waste my time with watching it. But I really enjoy reality TV. I think it's a wonderful thing. It was really hard to go through your early 20s being criticized that heavily. It was around this exact same time that Twitter just blew up. So that was challenging because people, unlike, you know, if you're watching things that are fully scripted, EastEnders, you might have a really strong opinion about someone. They've just killed someone. They've just set a house on fire. You know, they've cheated. This was sort of bridged the gap between that because it had to be bring the drama from that. So there were story producers who had worked on EastEnders before. You know, they had like a lot of experience in conjuring up really creative stories, but it was also then, it was real at the same time. So going through an uncomfortable, sad, heartbreaking breakup or finding out awful news was so humiliating when you had a camera in your face as well.
I can imagine.
And then when people are going online and calling you all sorts of things, it was really savage, actually. And I think people have become a lot more respectful since then. I think, like, I'm quite grateful that there's been a bit of a shift, that people now, you know, people will label a keyboard warrior. Like it's not socially acceptable to start speaking to people like that anymore in that same capacity, because it was devastating.
Yeah, for sure. No, absolutely. I can't imagine the impact of that. And obviously during that time, you went on to kind of enter the wellness space and start a few businesses. You had Live Like Louise, Turtle, and Pocket Sport. What was your experience of, I guess, deciding to start these businesses within the space, kind of off the back of what you were already doing at that time?
So I suppose before I created those businesses, I'd been doing a lot of work in the kind of social media space, unintentionally, really. It just became quite a lucrative career. Then I suppose a large part of it was actually down to meeting Ryan, my partner. I'd gone from dating people that indulged in quite unhealthy habits and behaviors, and, you know, I'd adopted a lot of them. And when I met Ryan, he taught me a lot. Like, he was very, very different to anyone that I'd spent a lot of time with. He taught me to love myself, to care a little bit less about what other people thought, to not feel as though you always have to fit in. And also, I really should thank him for changing my relationship with alcohol, because he's really not a big drinker. And he actually was quite upfront with me about how he felt about me when I would drink, and he really didn't like it. And I'm glad that he had the courage to do that. Because a lot of people would just be like, yeah, you know, I think it just showed that he'd cared. He was like, I'm not going to let Louise treat herself like this. This is really destructive. You know, I was actually drinking a lot. I mean, there were times when I was drinking 72 hours in a row. I'd end up in some pretty bad places. And the knock-on effect of that was horrendous, really, whether it was losing stuff, physical things, losing jobs. I mean, there were jobs that I genuinely couldn't turn up to, and also relationships as well. I really pushed people away, and even, you know, family members. It was not nice. Even my brother would say that I wasn't a particularly nice person to be around when I was drunk. I was either your best friend, or if I knew you really well, so if you were my boyfriend or a family member, I could be quite mean, I think. And yeah, so I made this big transition when I met Ryan, and he obviously was a personal trainer, and we met. It was so cliche. He wasn't actually my personal trainer, but I was doing a triathlon, which I didn't end up doing in the end, but he was sort of connected to the lady that was doing the PR. So we met that way. And as I got into it, you know, I noticed that the rewards from looking after myself, I ended up doing the women's health cover, which was incredible. I just felt so good in myself. And actually my whole relationship with the job I was doing, which was the TV stuff, completely changed. I just felt as though I was back in the driving seat of my life. No one could get in my ear and tell me what to do or say anymore. I could be me. And that felt really empowering. And off the back of that, I met somebody, actually, a lovely Welsh guy who Ryan knew from Cardiff. And it was one of those amazing, almost like serendipitous moments. He just came to our house. I can't remember why. But that day we ended up having an all-day conversation about what we wanted to change in the fitness space. And that really looked like just making everything that I'd done accessible to the masses. Small changes, you know, like the compound effect of like little lifestyle differences. But I think a lot of people I think the good thing actually about the business was that people thought I was a bit more approachable and accessible than some other people, because I hadn't always been, you know, I don't know, I don't want this to land wrong, but I was never the kind of I wasn't the princess on Main Chelsea. I wasn't like the tall, long, limby one with the incredible hair and like the infinite beauty. And that's, you know, I'm very happy and very fortunate with the way that I am, but I don't think I ever had that character. So I think people saw me as someone that had a few issues that I was quite honest about, and I'd gone from here to here, and they were like, okay, well, there's something quite appealing in that. So how do I get a piece of that pie? So yeah, we just wanted to educate. And initially it was just through fitness programs. And then, as you'll know, the industry just changed so quickly. And I think with obviously lockdown throughout COVID, we pivoted and everything became online, and we built a really loyal community of people. And it was really fun. And it was one of the things that just got us through, as well as them. And with the Pocket Sport, so the activewear brand, that was something actually I started at uni as a hobby, like really, with another guy that I studied with there. So it was small, tiny baby brand. Originally it was denim, and then it became t-shirts. We realized denim is such a hard space to crack and incredibly competitive. And then, yeah, we made kind of other more merchy things to accommodate or to go alongside while I was on TV. And then when I went through the big fitness transformation, we decided it made sense to make something that I could enjoy and wear myself. And so both grew quite a lot, like as I was on this sort of like health rise. And I lived in the stuff. And it was, I look back, and I've looked back quite a lot over the last couple of years and thought, why did I love lockdown so much? It was a really positive time for me. And I know that it was a really tough time for some other people. So I'm mindful when I say that. I don't want to come across as selfish, but it was a really exciting, lucrative time for me and for my family, and with my brother living next door, and, you know, me and my partner living together, and actually my business partner lives on the other side of us. So we're literally like the mafia all in a line. We really got things going, and then everything changed when I fell pregnant, and then when I got really sick.
And before we come to touch on that, because I want to really, you know, give some space and time to really, you know, go into that part of your life and your journey. With your businesses, you obviously built incredible businesses, and has been so great to see their kind of growth and your growth as an entrepreneur. I know that you recently made the decision to liquidate one of your businesses. Mm-hmm. Could you talk me through that decision? And yeah, I can imagine that was pretty heartbreaking. Yeah. I don't know the story, but I can imagine that was really tough. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Of course. It's a really recent thing that I'm going through. And, you know, you will know better than most how hard it is to build up a business from scratch. We never had any external investment. So we did really, really well as a small team to keep an activewear business going with so many competitors out there. You know, at times there were 2 of us, 3 of us, 4 of us, maximum. I think there were 6 of us ever. And unfortunately, we had a period of rapid growth during lockdown. And I think we probably didn't reinvest in the company in the way that we should. And I think we should have invested in people and better people, and hiring up and hiring, you know, people with more experience than us, because I don't have a business background, and actually my business partner doesn't either. So it was very much a hobby brand and business, and we learned a lot along the way. But then when I got really unwell, the business basically got put on pause, and it made me realize actually that it was never sustainable to have any business that relied so solely on me as the face of it, especially if we wanted to exit in 3, 5, however many years. I can't always be the person that's there flaunting my body, smiling in a mirror and pushing a product, because it doesn't serve me well. It doesn't serve my family well. And, everything changes when you become a parent anyway, and your relationship with your body changes. And I've been through so many physical changes as it is, and it just didn't suit me anymore. So I think on a lot of reflection, I was, and I'll come on to all of the trauma stuff, but I was so incredibly unwell for a year postpartum that I couldn't even think about any business. I struggled to turn a light on or feed myself. But then as I started to get better, I thought, okay, I'm being pulled in some different directions here, and things that are actually a lot more meaningful to me. And I know that my time is limited. So does it make sense to continue with this kind of fashion brand anymore? The opportunity cost of doing it was taking me away from things that I'd rather be doing. It's been really heartbreaking. As I mentioned before, I'm not good with change. They always say, my life coach, who I work with her again now, and actually even my accountant said, Louise, this business, it's not good for you. You're putting money in, someone else is taking it out. You need to let go. It does make me feel quite sad because I haven't really accepted it properly yet. And I wasn't ready. And I'm glad that I waited, because mentally I'm doing so much better now. I'm stronger. So I want to make the decision from a place of clarity in my head. If I'd done it any sooner, I would have had trauma brain. And they always say, don't make any major life decisions the first couple of years after a traumatic incident. Don't get a divorce if you can avoid it. Obviously, there are circumstances where you have to. Don't move house, don't cut all your hair off. I did that as well. Ron and I nearly broke up. There are a lot of things that we just missed out on. But I guess, don't make any massive changes with the company. And I think deep down, I just knew that I couldn't, even though it would have been easier just to cut ties with everything when I was in the trenches. But I just kind of kept everything sizzling along. And then we got to a point where we were like, is this worth the struggle anymore? It's not. And we were having a lot of repetitive conversations. And without extra financing, we just didn't have the potential. The product was great and the community was great. And I really wanted to bring out a stoma legging, which we'd started working on, which would have obviously been a major passion project for me. And I've got a cool, WhatsApp group of girls who've all got stomas who had the same operation at the same hospital. And we were kind of getting all creative about it together. And it felt nice. And I thought this could be the resurgence. But we just didn't have everything else that we needed in terms of the infrastructure to really get it going. So I just think someone else will do it so much better than me. And I'm okay with that. And I could be the face of it. And that's okay.
And I think it takes a huge amount of strength to walk away from something that's no longer serving you. And I think that, you can definitely rest easy knowing that, as you said, you did not rush. You didn't rush. You made sure that it was something that you were really comfortable with and felt, was the right decision. And ultimately, that's all you can do. You can't predict how everything's going to turn up. And I guess what advice would you give to someone that's currently dealing with something that doesn't really serve them, but they think they might need to get let go of, but they'd struggle with the change, all of that?
I think the thing that I have, which is an advantage, is that I always have at the back of my mind the memory of everything almost disappearing. So I really know how short life is. If something isn't serving you, you just have to let go of it, because you never know what's around the corner. And I think if you can find confidence within yourself and strength within yourself to know that there's always, without sounding arrogant, I feel as though there will always be something that I can do and something that I can offer, because I'm hardworking and because I like working. So I'm not worried about it. I think you just have to value yourself and your time. Like time is everything. And if you're losing sleep over something, you're lying in bed at night and you're worried. I've had that recently with some TV opportunities that have come my way, and I've actually said no to them because I was lying in bed and I was actually dreaming and having nightmares about them. And I thought, if this is happening, I can't commit to that.
Yeah.
And I've always been someone that's terrible at saying no and terrible at shutting things down. So I suppose you've just got to trust in the fact that if I can do it, like, you can do it too.
Yeah. No, well, I think that's great advice. And I think that it really is, you know, it's one of the toughest things to walk away from something that you really don't want to walk away from, but you need to. But at the same time, I believe so strongly that you cannot welcome anything into your life that is meant for you whilst holding on to things that are no longer meant for you, because they're taking up time and space that would be taking up, you know, that you would be offered that opportunity. And I think that's really important to, like, you know, sometimes you do just need to take the leap. That's not saying it's not easy. You've obviously been through a lot over the past few years. And I can imagine that having had this as something that's just happened is obviously really, you know, it doesn't help. And it's horrible to, you know, it's horrible to go through and to really feel like that's a necessary part of your journey to kind of get to the next step. I'd like to, you know, talk about your kind of journey in November 2021. I know you say that you had a day that was kind of the best and worst day of your life. Could you talk me through whatever you're comfortable talking about in terms of what happened?
Essentially, I went into my childbirth a really healthy person. I'd always, you know, I'd been really healthy. Like I'd made this whole career out of being super healthy. I'd never had any experience in a hospital. Very few experiences, even at my GP, or taking any medication. You know, I think I've probably taken paracetamol a handful of times in my entire life. I did have an underlying condition, which was my inflammatory bowel disease, but it was very, very low maintenance. It was easy to control. I didn't feel great towards the end of my pregnancy, and I was anxious. I'd been involved in a house fire. I was living at my mum's because we were doing a renovation, which is very typical. A lot of people seem to redo their homes when they're pregnant, which is crazy, but then probably works out for the best long term. So it was a bit of a weird time for me anyway, like coming out of that kind of lockdown haze and then living at my mum's house, which was a bit weird because I haven't lived with my parents since I was 11 because I went to boarding school. And I started to not feel great about the idea of the birth, which was then amplified by the fact that we were involved in this very scary house fire. So to sort of summarize, well, you know, because I can talk too much, so I'll try and explain it fairly succinctly. And also, I'm sorry if I'm a bit like jolty with things, because sometimes when you do retrace your steps with trauma, your brain just like occasionally would kind of just pause or shut down for a bit and you get a little bit muddled. But yeah, one night the fire alarm went off, and you know, when you think, you just assume, because you've heard loads of fire alarms, fake fire alarms, fire alarm practices, I'm sure you have them in this building. You just assume that it's a fake. And then within 5 seconds, I was like, no, there's a fire, because the smoke was filling the whole house so intensely to the point where I couldn't see my hand, which is petrifying. And now I understand the significance of the smoke when everyone says you die from inhaling the smoke versus the actual fire, the flames themselves. And you all, you know, I thought, and you know, even when you watch things on the news, you're so far removed from them. Even having a conversation with a friend, you're still so far removed. Until something actually happens to you, you just don't know how you're going to react, but also you can't understand the level of fear in that moment. And it's such a specific fear when you're engulfed in smoke because you can't see anything. And even though you think that you're someone that's very fit, healthy, you know, able-bodied, you know, someone that could jump out of a window and be absolutely fine, I had moments where I really, really believed that I was going to die. We ran out, everyone managed to get out safely, and I was in a state of shock. So it really was not the best thing, kind of the best start. And that was, I think I was only about a month out from giving birth at that point. So I was really heavy. Ron and I had been sleeping in separate rooms because I was so uncomfortable. And actually, oddly, I think we had actually had an argument. So it was really strange, again, that this fire had kind of brought us back together. It was a little significant that it happened on the same day. But yeah, so we all got outside, sat, luckily we had a car to sit in. Obviously all of the neighbors came out. I was in my pants and a t-shirt, and you don't care about that kind of thing when you feel like you've just escaped a near-death experience. But I was just screaming on the street, and one of my dogs went missing in the house, and Ryan actually managed to find him and get him back, but it was very dangerous, him going back in. And then we had the whole encounter with the fire brigade and that whole thing. And that was, I guess, my first real experience of spending a bit of time in the hospital. So we went in and they checked the baby, and they had to check for carbon monoxide poisoning and, all of the routine checks. And Ryan's hair actually was covered. He actually had, he had white hair at the time. Like really blonde, sort of Eminem style hair, and it had gone completely grey. It was crazy that we'd been coated almost immediately. So that was devastating. And then following that, leaving the hospital, not knowing where to go is a really weird place to be mentally. And none of us were okay. Like me, my mum and Ryan were in shock. Luckily, the dogs could go around the corner to my business partner. And we were like, well, who do we call? Like we look and smell, and we smelled for days. We could not get rid of the smell. It was embedded in us and in our hair, in our skin. So we had to stay in a hotel for a couple of weeks, and then we actually moved into my dad's flat in London. He spent some time up in Yorkshire. And I was sort of on high alert. I don't think I'd properly processed the fire, because I was anticipating the birth of my child and not knowing where I was going to be and whether I had all the stuff for him, whether I had a room for him.
I mean, it's a hugely, in anyone's life, like the month before you're giving birth to your first child, I can imagine in the best of circumstances, you're thinking, am I ready for this? Like, what do I need to get for this? It's very much, we literally have a psychological nesting like pattern that we go into, but to have that happen at that time, I just can't even imagine how terrifying and unsettling that would have been.
Incredibly unsettling. And we didn't get to do any of that nesting thing because our house was nowhere near ready to be finished, and we did feel like we didn't have a home. And I did also worry that I was going to come into labour prematurely from the shock. So when I, immediately after the fire, my whole body was convulsing for a really long time and I couldn't calm down. And I did think, what's the damage going to be from all of that cortisol and all of that stress on the baby? What's that going to look like? Is it going to cause me to go into an early labour? And there were, and it was the little things like when we then did move into this flat, how far away is that from the hospital? Are we then going to have to give birth in a different hospital? Are we going to, I felt completely powerless. So I sent an email to the hospital, and I'd already, in every appointment that I'd had with the midwife leading up to that point, I'd already suggested that I really wanted to have a C-section, because looking at the stats of all of my friends that had had babies following the lockdown period, 9 out of 10 of them had had C-sections. I'd say 50% of those were emergency and 50 were planned. And I'm a data person. And obviously that's a small that's a small selection of people. And that doesn't reflect the whole nation. But I looked at that and I thought, I would like to have some control over my birth. I'm also a very small person. I've got a tiny body. I've got like snake hips, and my partner's very big. And all of the scans had shown very different things when it came to Leo's size. His head size was big, and I just thought, there's no way that I'm going to get a baby out of me naturally. So I panicked. After the fire, I sent an email to the hospital and I said, these are all of the reasons why I would really like to be taken seriously for a C-section. We need to make this happen. How can we make it happen? Can you give me a date? What are the next steps? Because as somebody that's never given birth before, you only know what you've been told. It's not really common for friends to tell friends about things to do with birth, because I think largely actually people don't want to put people off. I think people don't want to scare people. I don't know. It's a tricky conversation to have with people sometimes. I'd find it easier to talk about this on a podcast even than speaking to one of my close friends. My best friend gave birth to me 2 months afterwards. That was one of the reasons why I was very careful that I didn't share my story even on social media for a few months until a few months after it had happened. But yeah, so I sent this email and I never got a response. And there are things that still pop up now. Occasionally, you know, I'll have a moment where I think, let me go and revisit that email. Like, I need to go and see that email again. Like, why did no one ever reply to that? So I remember what I was basically saying before about not feeling like you know where to get the answers. So in this email, if no one's going to respond to me there, who do I call? I'm not calling 999 or 111. Where do I go to get the answer to where do I get the C-section from? And you get, when you are pregnant, you get a booklet, and there are sort of a lot of box ticking things in there, and they kind of fill out some information, and you do have like your diabetes test and a couple of things. But I think there needs to be more of a comprehensive manual that goes into detail about like birthing options, and would you like to go and look around the hospital, and if you have this question, who's your point of contact? So there was no continuity of care. I mean, very infrequently did I see the same person twice. So I didn't build up a relationship with anyone. And I have spoken to other people. One of my good friends gave birth up in Scotland, and I think the healthcare system up there is very different when it comes to the maternity offering. She had an amazing experience, and she was with the same person the whole way through. So then you have that rapport, and you can really, you know, you feel as though they're on your side, they're on your team. I felt like I had no one on my team. And even I had to bring in Ron to a couple of the appointments to try and advocate for me. And even he found it really hard. And you know, as I've already explained about Ryan, like he's quite good at not caring too much about what people think. So we didn't get the outcome that we wanted, and I went into labour on my due date. I think it's quite common for people to be turned away from the hospital because they're not quite ready. Then we did end up going back to the hospital, and it was on a weekend, and there was skeleton staffing, and essentially we were put in a room and had very, very little support, and things just escalated, and all of the things that you can imagine that could go wrong went wrong. I developed sepsis quite early on. They were treating me for infections. They did break my waters. There was meconium in the waters. I started feeling really unwell, and I think that that's a sign of infection I was hallucinating. I was really, really like in a total state of confusion. The pain went from here to here almost immediately because Leo was back to back. No one had told me. I didn't know what it meant to be back to back. No one had ever said, here are the potential positions. The baby could be this way, this way, this way, this way. I'd heard of the word breech before. I sound so ill-informed, but I'm someone that's fairly assertive and astute, and still, you know, going into this, not knowing what where my baby even was inside me is awful that they wouldn't tell you that. So if they're back to back, it can be really uncomfortable because their spine can grind against your spine. So it was horrendous. And they didn't, there's a protocol where if you request an epidural, they need to give it to you, I think within a 90-minute window is reasonable, because obviously pain management is so important when you're in a hospital environment and if you're really in significant amount of pain. And it took many, many hours for them to be able to get that in. Then there was a shift change the following morning, and by that point it had been a night of hell. And then it became an emergency because there was a consultant who saw that he wasn't going to come out of me. And she tried to manually turn him inside me and nothing was working. So we went into theatre. And the thing about a C-section, you know, my understanding of it was that it should be a 20-minute, 30-minute operation. And so it's still a major abdominal surgery. They're having to go through many layers of your skin, of your tummy. But it looked controlled, and speaking to everybody that I knew who had had one, you know, I had these parameters in my head. My operation ended up being over 3 hours, lying there awake, watching myself bleeding to death, losing, in that operation, 3.5 liters of blood. Many scares throughout that operation, a lot of shouting, urgency, people coming, they couldn't stem the bleeding. No one communicating at all what was going on. And, you know, my partner was sat next to me, and I just honestly kept turning to him, asking him whether I was still alive, because I really, really believed that I was dead. I couldn't understand how I could still be alive. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. And I suppose just to put it into there's so much, Grace. I mean, I was moved onto a trolley and I was put into a side room, which is not considered the proper practice. So I should have been in a high dependency unit because I lost a lot of blood. So I lost 3.5 liters in that operation. I think I probably have 3.5 liters in my body. I then go on, I've had 5 operations in the last 2.5 years, and I've lost over 12 liters of blood. And I thought that a liter was closer to a pint, but it was only before I came into this podcast today, I thought, in my book, I talk in a lot of detail about kind of what happened to me, and I have in other podcasts. And I want to offer like some different material as well. And I thought, like, how can I summarize for someone that asks me, what have you been through? I thought, okay, how do I just summarize this crazy story? Because there is so much to say. 5 operations, 12 liters of blood. 1 large Evian bottle is 1.5 liters of blood. So I've lost 8 large Evian bottles. How is that even feasible? So I was sent home prematurely after a few days in the hospital in excruciating pain. I'd had a CT scan, which I had to really push for. Like, I had to advocate really hard for it. And it showed that there was potential signs of active arterial bleeding, which basically means internal bleeding. But I only figured that out much, much, much later. So they sent me home, and 2 days later I had an enormous hemorrhage at home at night in our house, which we'd scrambled to get to a place where it was like somewhat livable. So we did have running water and hot water. And in that moment, I can't tell you what went on in my head. It did not make sense to me how I was still alive, because from nowhere, blood was just pouring out of me, like nothing I've ever seen in my entire life before. Not even in a movie, not even when someone gets shot, not when someone gets their arm taken off. It was everywhere. So the fear that basically consumed my head, I mean, the roller coaster of screaming to Ryan, who was in a different room, to then get the ambulance to come. They luckily came in a couple of minutes and they got me to hospital very quickly. I think my brain at one point just shut down. I was on my own, thinking that I was going to die on my own. And I think that's one of the worst parts of it all. I mean, there are a few things that I think have made all of my PTSD basically boils down to that moment, because that before I was put to sleep, I was begging to be put to sleep because it was so painful in my head that I was going to die every second, that I was shouting, someone help me, help me, help me, help me, put me to sleep. Like, I want to die, I want to die, I want to die. Just turn it off. Like, I needed someone to turn the lights off because I didn't want to consciously live this experience, because I don't think that I think everything in the way that we're designed is to not have to experience that, to not get that close to death, to then actually survive and to keep witnessing it. It was awful. And knowing that I was never, in my head, I really believed that I was never going to see any of my family members again, that I was never going to get to know my baby, and that I just didn't think I was ever going to wake up again was really terrifying. And I did. I woke up. I actually woke up. And I woke up in intensive care and I had no idea what was going on. And I had loads of tubes down my throat and I didn't recognize anyone because my family weren't there. So I just woke up in a room that I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what had happened. I think there's the problem with an emergency. There's no reassurance and preparation. If I've had other surgeries that have been less of an emergency, to be able to look into someone's face and for them to say, this is what we're going to do, to see something in them, like a little bit of human nature, heart, soul, and to find some trust that they're going to do their best to like keep you alive. That is so important going into an operation, to have those moments to ask a few questions, to have the moments to get to know that they're going to put something in you that's going to send you to sleep, and that you might wake up at this time, and then that's what the recovery might look like, to have the expectations. But it's just the pure, like, bam, it's just the unknown, it's the abyss. So it was just petrifying.
And how long did it take for you to be able to go home from then?
So I went home about a month after I gave birth to my son. And then, you know, I had a moment of like pure euphoria where I like collapsed at home, and I was like, I'm just so grateful to be back home, and I'm so happy. Thank goodness. And then I had a week where I was basically in bed and I was just being looked after. And I thought I actually really thought I was going to be okay. And then my brain just went, and I started really suffering with extreme debilitating anxiety, which wasn't just, oh, I'm scared. I couldn't rationalize it. It wasn't like I'd have a scary thought come in. It wasn't, oh, I'm nervous because I've got to do something hard at work, or I've got to have a tricky conversation with someone, or someone doesn't like me, or I'm worried, or I'm sad. It was perpetual fear in my brain, to the point where I was in such a state of survival that I couldn't, my brain started doing something which my psychiatrist explained to me as being analyzing of thoughts. And I would say it's the closest thing to getting to madness, because you're basically obviously we have tens of thousands of thoughts that go through our head every day if you're a normal person. But every thought that came in through my head, I was analyzing, because my body, my brain were obviously so scared of what the thought might be. It didn't want to let in any of the horrible thoughts. So I was just analyzing every single thing that came into my head, that it didn't allow any, you know, anything normal, like to pass by. You know, I was just living in a horrible, horrible place.
Yeah, I can imagine that was terrifying. And I can imagine there's so much change in that whole situation anyway. Take away everything you went through. Having a child, especially your first child, you know, moving house at the same time, all of this, there's a lot of change, there's a lot of moving parts. And I can imagine, you know, anyone would get overwhelmed in kind of the best of situations. Obviously, to combine that with what you went through, the hormonal changes on top of that, everything, to kind of come to terms with the fact that you've also just had a baby and you're going through this huge change in your relationship as well, and all of these different things. How was your relationship with Leo during this time?
I didn't have a relationship with Leo, because I really didn't care. And I say that now comfortably, because I know that I have a great relationship with my son. Like, I love Leo, and I was with him most of this morning. And that's an enormous relief, and hopefully gives hope to anyone listening. But it was non-existent in the beginning. He would come in, Ryan would bring him in to visit in the hospital in his little car seat. And I really didn't care that he was there, because all I could think about was myself. It was just a thing. I mean, and then even when we were at home, I was quite scared of him. I think that the idea of having any responsibility except for just looking after myself was petrifying, and my body just didn't have the space for it at all. Like, I couldn't even, like, you know, Ryan had to fully look after me and Leo, with the help of my family and then some other people that had to step in as well, to the point where I couldn't make a phone call. I mean, he had to literally speak on my behalf, communicate for me. And so at times I couldn't even communicate. I felt like I couldn't talk properly. So I couldn't even really talk to my son. I couldn't talk to anybody. So he was there. And occasionally I would have moments where I'd kind of almost snap out of this like dissociated state, because I was dissociated a lot early on. I mean, it was almost like my body had just created like an external person. I was living in someone else's body, and I'd forgotten everything I knew about my former life. Like, it was just done, like dead. Like, old Louise had just died, and I was just living in this shell, like hiding in it, just hibernating. And yeah, and Leo was was there, and it was hard because I was so exhausted. So I needed to sleep to recover physically and mentally. I think with all of, the way my brain was working was just so tiring. So it was really hard because he was waking us up all night. And I think, and Ryan would agree with me on this, I think because of the circumstances, he didn't have the love that he needed as a newborn, because all a newborn really needs is love, skin on skin, affection, and their basic needs being met. And there wasn't much contact at all from anyone, because anyone that came around really as well was nurturing me largely, because I suppose my family had already had an existing relationship with me. They didn't have a relationship with Leo yet. So the love probably was all being directed to like the fear that they were going to lose someone that they had known for 34 years or 32 years. But we did our best, and I fought through, and I would just fake it, and I would lie next to him sometimes, and I would do I would try and get into a bit of a routine. But it was I remember, and I think I mentioned this in the book, that when the crisis team came, because I was on suicide watch, they would ask me how much time I'd spent with my son that day. And I do remember saying 3 minutes, and then 4 minutes and 5 minutes. And they honestly would be like, that's amazing. Well done. That's incredible. And looking back now, I mean, I get goosebumps because I just can't imagine that it's me. It's so weird because it's not who I am as a person, and I would be an amazing mother if I had the choice to have been an amazing mother. I just did the best that I could. That was it. And I clung on to whatever hope I could find, thinking, okay, one day I might be okay again. And luckily, Leo's come out of this really unscathed, which is really amazing.
And what about your relationship with Ryan?
Also horrendous. We didn't have a relationship for a long time. He would get into bed with me sometimes at night, and I would get angry because I would get a fright, because I would get really scared. I genuinely I felt like there was a stranger that was getting into bed with me, which, it sounds dramatic. These are just real feelings. We didn't really talk much. I think he hated me. I think he resented me for everything, even though, now with a logical head on his shoulders, he knows that none of this was my fault. But he was dealing with his own version of PTSD. And that is something that I've only been able to accept in the last year, because I didn't really care about how he was feeling throughout this whole thing. We were just both like looking inwards all the time and not communicating at all. And I didn't think that we were going to get through it. And he had to go away at one point, and I think he's opened up about that now, which is why I don't mind saying it, because it's really for him to kind of talk more about his experience. But he was really unhappy, so he had to take himself away because he was just really like destructive. And that was probably 9 months after the birth. Things just built up, I suppose, because it comes the whole recovery is waves and different chapters. And he would have been, we've had to sort of go like this, up and down. Like, he'll have to be okay when I'm absolutely not okay. Then the moment that I'm slightly okay again, he can let his guard down and he can be in a bad state. And even more recently, with my recent stoma surgery, I was in a really, really bad spot, and he, looked after my son, and he was putting on a brave face, smiling. I'll get everything done. I'm going to organize everything with your family, the hospital visits, all of it. And then the moment that I came home, he crashed and got himself into quite a bad state of depression, actually, for a couple of months. And I felt so lucky because I'd had life. So I just felt so good that that I'd had another shot at life, and that that I was still here. So I had that perspective of, I've been down here and now I'm okay. Like, I'm going to live. So thank goodness. Whereas he felt like the unluckiest person in the world. So our perspectives on everything that has happened are very different.
How have you managed to build from that point to now, I guess?
people hate this answer. Or I hate when I hear people say time, because you don't feel like you have time when you're in a moment like that. I had to actually avoid him for a chunk until I rebuilt my own strength with like a Bax accredited incredible therapist who I trusted with my life, and also a coach. And I had to protect myself until I felt strong enough to be able to go in and try and resolve the issues we had within the relationship, because you can't do it. You can't have important conversations when you're feeling so weak, because you'll be triggered by the smallest thing. If he'd said something like a tiny bit damning, or like that I took a tiny bit personally, then I would completely spiral and potentially then end up feeling suicidal again. So we really had to just distance, work on ourselves, and then come back together. And now we're good, actually. Like, we're actually good. And I can't imagine that there would be much that we wouldn't be able to work through now that we've been through this. And we're going to be doing a podcast together, which feels really, really nice, so that we can encourage people to have uncomfortable conversations in a partnership. Brian's not typically a really good talker. Like, he doesn't love communicating. And I think that comes from his family. Like, they're all very good at, they're all like very stoic. And I respect them for that. Like, I love his family, but he's really learning to open up more. And actually it's paying off. So he wants other people to too.
Yeah.
It's good, doesn't it?
Of course. And I think that, I'm sure there's so much that you two, having been through this together, like, I can't imagine how tough that would have been in all different ways, but kind of really thinking about how a relationship even managed to come out the other side feels like a huge testament to the strength of it. But I can also imagine that you have so much to share, and so much that people going through all sorts of different things could really benefit from. Obviously, you spoke about how recently as well you had another operation, you had a colectomy. When you went into that operation, did you know that there was a chance of you coming out with a stoma bag, or was that a complete surprise?
I did know, and I actually was begging for it by that point. So I've had this condition, the inflammatory bowel disease, but specifically ulcerative colitis. So it's you either have ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. You can sort of have a combination of both. But I've had it for 6 years. And as I mentioned before, it was always fairly mild. And then I think it was triggered, it can get worse during pregnancy, or it can completely go away. So if it gets bad, it's called a flare. I was absolutely fine. And then about 3 months after giving birth to Leo, mine started getting really, really horrendous. And I think, stress is obviously a huge contributor. And with post-traumatic stress disorder, it got really, really bad. So I did have a hospital stay when my son was probably 7 months old. And I managed to get into remission. So I was treated with some medication then in the hospital. And I remember them coming in. And so there's sort of the gastros who do more of the medical intervention. And then there's the surgical team. And they operate. I remember the nurses saying, they're going to introduce you to the surgical team. And I remember thinking, what? Like, there's no way that I'm having surgery. And also, given everything I've just been through, I mean, it kind of almost just went over here. But I was like, I've never considered that in my entire life. I can't imagine myself as being someone that would ever have to go through that. Like, that's not me. Like, you've got the wrong person. And I'm like hugely grateful to my body and to whoever is looking out for me for not putting me through that operation back then, because I wouldn't have been able to handle that recovery whilst also going through everything else. So I was okay, and I had a good stint for about a year, and then I started getting a flare up at the back end of last year. And I thought, it will be okay. I'm resilient. I've been through a lot. And it kind of it got the better of me. And I stupidly went away at the beginning of this year. I mean, I shouldn't give myself such a hard time. I wanted to take my foot off the gas during a month, which is pretty horrendous here. And I'd had really horrendous Januaries with my health over the previous years. So I went away with family, feeling quite safe in that decision. But I had to fly back early because I was bleeding a lot. And that's very traumatic, obviously, for me, given that I've had so many hemorrhages. Well, 3 major hemorrhages. So I was straight off the plane and A&E. It was bad. Like, it was really bad. Like, I almost didn't make it. Like, on the plane, I was sat on the loo the whole time. Like, I don't mind saying this kind of stuff. Like, I'm always mindful of just, I don't want other people to feel embarrassed when I say it, but I had a prolapse. I say these things because it might help people out there. I was in agony. Like, I was really unwell. And I went in to the hospital and was like, what are we going to do now? Like, where do we go from here? And I was taken up into a room. And actually, one of the lovely ladies who I'd met previously, who helped me with my obs-gynae stuff, she came and saw me in the hospital and was like, I can't believe that you're back here. But she was very kind and I was very well looked after. And I actually had an amazing experience. Like, I've seen what NHS care can look like on both ends of the spectrum. And I know what is possible, which is why I'm speaking up about all of this, because I really think that the maternity care is the thing that needs like a big nudge. But the gastro team were great. So they've removed basically my large intestine, which is the one that goes around, kept in all of the small intestines, which are actually the important bit because they absorb all of your nutrients. And they basically have connected. So my small intestine, a tiny bit of it now comes out through my stomach.
And how has your life changed since then?
You know what? It's been really, really positive for me. I never thought I'd be someone that sat here with a stoma, and I never thought I'd be saying that, but it has changed my life for the better. And I'm really grateful. And when I was recovering, all of the stoma team were like, we've honestly never seen someone so positive about having a stoma. They're like, you've adapted psychologically really well to this. I'm like, you should have seen the stuff that I went through before.
I've practiced.
Yeah, I've had a lot of experience here. And actually, at least you guys were nice. Like, yeah, the compounding traumas, they put them into a spectrum. It's given me my life back. I feel a lot healthier in myself. I feel, there is obviously an enormous brain-gut connection, and I do feel like my brain is working a lot better now. And it's not terribly inconvenient. It's pretty disgusting when you first wake up with it, because unless you've got any medical training, like, when have you ever seen an organ before? It's a bit alarming. You're a bit like, oh gosh, I've just never seen the insides of a body. So to see a bit of the insides pulled outwards is challenging, but it becomes the norm quite quickly. It's amazing how adaptable we are as humans.
And after everything you've been through, what is the type of life that you want to build for yourself now?
I would love to, I'm quite particular now about the things that I do, which I think is a really good thing. So going through all of this has taught me to say no to anything that doesn't feel right. I really appreciate how precious time is, and especially with being a parent as well. It's just, you're so busy. Like, looking after a child is a lot. So I'm conscious. I'm really conscious about like where to spend my energy. And I really do, without sounding like some sort of woo-woo philanthropic, person, I do want to do things that are going to leave more of a legacy, or just helping people. I love talking about this sort of thing. I love making people feel better and less alone. I love writing. So as I mentioned before, I was never creative. I hated English and all of those subjects. Weirdly, my trauma has allowed me to tap into a part of my brain where I can write. I think when I wasn't able to, communicate in other ways so well, it was the only way that I could, was just getting everything out of my head and onto paper. But now I've realized I enjoy it, and I find so much satisfaction in that. And it's time consuming. So I like to chunk out like 90 minutes a day if I can, to get into that kind of flow state of just seeing what comes out. And that feels really good. Yeah.
And to end, I'd love to know what the best piece of advice is that you've ever been given.
Ever.
Yeah, I know.
Wow. Well, no, my grandma said KBO. I think that was a Churchill statement. She was like, keep bashing on. And I was like, okay, I love how flippantly you can say that when I've been through all of this trauma. She's just like, KBO. Like, oh my God.
Bang.
That generation, I'm telling you, never complain once. It's not for me. But it's not bad. I mean, she's doing really well, and she's in her late 80s, so respect to her and my grandpa. When I was on my way here, I was feeling a bit anxious, and I remembered something that Zara said to me, which was, no one knows yourself better than you. And I think that, and that might be quite specific advice going into doing something like a podcast, but it could also, relate to if you're just feeling a bit unsure, in a social setting or anything. The world isn't always trying to trip you up. You, like, just speak your truth, be you, and you can't get it wrong. Like, you can't fail that way. I think even when I was having that chat with Elizabeth Day, and she was like, how are you so honest, like unflinchingly honest? And I'm like, because it's the only way that you'll never get yourself in trouble.
No, I think that's true. And I think it's also a way to really own yourself and who you are and what you've been through, because as you say, no one can take your truth away from you.
Yeah.
Like, that is your truth. That is your perspective of your truth. And that, no matter what anyone else feels about that, that's never, that's
not wrong.
It's not wrong, and it can't be wrong. And I think that's, it's a very powerful thing to remember. And there are certain times that I think we all probably need to remember that more.
100%. Like, I don't need to sit here and be an expert. For so long, I lived in fear that I needed to be, an expert in everything. And that was so, like, it was just exhausting. And I feel so liberated just being free of that.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today. You've been amazing and so incredibly honest and open. And I have no doubt that the way you tell your story and the way you're so open about it, and you've been able to kind of own it in public, I have no doubt has changed many, many lives. So you're incredible.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. This has been so refreshing. And like, such a good host.
Oh,
man.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.